Hi again, welcome back to the podcast, episode 169 today. Adrian here from Sofeast, and Renaud is with me.
Yeah, how are you doing?
Good, still in China. And whoever was listening to last week's podcast will have heard us speaking about some of the changes that you'll probably see in China if you're going to be visiting soon, as many people are. And actually, some of our customers have been coming to the office, the Sofeast office, and to Agilian, probably it's got to be 6 months now, hasn't it?
Yeah, a few of them started to have, a couple of them had business visas end of last year, actually.
Yeah.
It was possible.
Yeah.
They had to go through quarantine and everything. And then after that, from the start of the change of policy, then, still visas were very rare. And also there were not that many flights. But then from, let's say, after Chinese New Year, we started to see more and more customers come through, but people are still used to doing, Zoom calls or team calls and things like that much more than before.
Yeah.
So we're still doing many more of those than in 2018, 2019, including for, hey, you want to visit the factory? Hey, you want to do a visit of the lab? You want to do a visit of the assembly lines, let's set it up, So there's much more of that than before. People are kind of used to it much more. But I mean, when you look at the flights, you look at the visa situation, especially in certain countries, including the US, by the way, things are not as fluid and as easy as before, right? It's not, we're not at that level yet.
But I would say from my experience, it's not too bad. I think it's a lot more accessible than it was.
Of course. If you want to come, you come.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah.
Sure.
I mean, I think the business visa situation, you'll notice if you're going to apply for a Chinese business visa, there's a huge document to fill out now. Didn't we count the pages? Was it something like 30 pages or something?
I forgot, but it goes into insane details, including personal details and things like that. Yeah.
So I guess that's kind of a new barrier for entry. But look, if you can sort of smash through that and get on a flight, I think, well, from my point of view, you won't be disappointed. So that was last week anyway. A bit of a recap there. Definitely worth listening to if you are coming to China soon. But today, Renaud, we are speaking about responsible and sustainable purchasing. And the two, they're not the same, but one kind of follows on into the next as you're going to explain. So shall we start by talking about responsible purchasing?
Yeah, right. So there's a lot of focus on, hey, these suppliers are causing us trouble. These suppliers are not compliant. These suppliers are doing things behind our backs. They don't tell us, and so on and so forth. But, it's always better to start sweeping in front of your own door rather than, first going to complain to suppliers and require them to do a lot of things, right? And the idea with responsible purchasing is that you are the organization that, picks the suppliers, issues, does the approvals of the new products and so on, maybe designs them. You issue the purchase orders and you do the payments, all these kind of things. Okay. You can do a lot of things to hurt your suppliers. Okay. And you can do a lot of things to prevent your suppliers from being able to actually comply to your requirements, or maybe just to treat their employees in a human way, and to be able to make everything in their own four walls rather than subcontracting. So that's the idea about responsible purchasing. And responsible purchasing practices is a term that people are using more and more. For example, I'm going to read something and then we can comment on it and talk about some examples. But you heard of Patagonia, right? Patagucci, very expensive gear, sport gear. Okay, nice products and a nice brand, and basically all the profits will go in like causes for the environmental preservation and so on. Still, like their clothing is made mostly in low cost Asian countries and so on and so forth. So how do they square that, right? talking a lot with a big mouth, and at the same time working with a lot of the same suppliers as their competition. Okay, so someone who was the VP of social and environmental responsibility at Patagonia, I'm going to quote what she wrote. We can send a link to that website later. It's a short quote. She says, "I strongly suspect that brands that have responsible purchasing practices programs have the highest rate of compliant factories. The RPP program is one that ensures that brand business decisions do not put the factory at risk of being out of compliance with their code of conduct and local laws." Okay. For example, a last-minute change to a design can directly cause excessive work hours and mandatory overtime, a form of forced labor, okay, for workers to ensure the order gets done on time. That's right. Without a solid RPP program, important root causes at the brand level can be missed, leaving you and the factory frustrated with the same issue coming up over and over again. That's right. There's a lot of ways, the way the purchasing organization works, and behaves, and the link it has on the supplier. Okay, so for example, here they say a last minute change to a design can cause a lot of excessive work hours, etc. Yeah, the buyer says at the last minute, "Oh, sorry, I need to make this change," and then like all the approvals are pushed back, but then they say, "Oh, sorry, you still have to ship, by 25 July. Like there's no way we can push that back, otherwise we're in deep trouble, right? Like that's the only way. Sorry." Or like latest end of the window is okay, like 30 July, and that's it. Out of that is not possible anymore. Okay, that's the reality, because the retailers, they say, okay, there's a window and that's it, right? So in that case, well, as I say, the approvals get done later, so there's less time for production, right? So in that case, what happens? Well, either they're going to put more resources. So usually, especially if it's in high season of the factory, they will try not to hire even more people, right? But they will say, okay, like, sorry guys, like, we have to, we're going to have to work 7 days a week. We're going to, 14 days now, 14 hours a day. We got to just make it like, sorry guys, put a lot of pressure on the production. And then what happens is that it's not legal, and also it they certainly don't comply with the retailer's social compliance code of conduct, right? But who caused that? The buyer, right? So who's responsible and accountable for that in my eyes? The buyer, right? Now, another the same idea, and this has been a problem with Walmart for as long as I can remember. Walmart will say, okay, we're going to buy whatever, 100,000 pieces of that style. Okay, let's say, again, garments. But it's the same in toys, it's the same in a lot of other things, right? So they say, okay, we're going to buy 100,000 pieces of this, whatever, this top, this garment. And that's the date. And then before that, they kind of ask, okay, you need to have a production, like a capacity plan, etc. You need to show us that you can actually make it in the factory. Okay. Because they really don't want subcontract work, right? Unauthorized subcontracting. Then the products with their labels can be made in factories they have not audited. There can be all kinds of problems. Can be a factory that burns down in Bangladesh. Can be a factory with, some kids. Okay, whatever. So they don't want subcontracting. So they try to cover themselves. They say, okay, we want you to give us a capacity plan. We're going to review it. We're going to do this. We're going to do that. If it's purchased through an importer, then the importer must have someone in the country who goes to check production and see what happens and so on and so forth. Okay, so that's the situation. But Walmart, on the other hand, they don't change, if an approval, the color is not exactly right or something, they'll just reject, and then the manufacturer is scrambled to submit something again and again until it's accepted. This in the cases I have seen anyway, there's no link to, wait a minute, they don't have a capacity to do it all before shipment now. Right? They don't care. Right? So they kind of cover their ass, but at the end of the day, they don't care. And the window for delivery is not pushed back, in most cases. So they're kind of forcing the suppliers to put a lot of pressure on production to go as fast as possible and to subcontract to a certain, in a certain to a certain degree, right? And there's a lot of that. I'm talking about Walmart because it's the biggest one, but there's so many other companies that do that, right? I don't want to pick just on Walmart. It's just very visible because they're huge. And they have all forms of problems. But that's an example. Okay. Now, an example in toys. Well, toys is extremely seasonal, right? There's a lot of toys are sold, let's say, November and December. Okay. Yeah. And that might be 60%, 70% of the business for certain brands, certain kinds of toys. So a lot of toy factories are very busy from May to August, September. Okay. So it's very seasonal. And this very seasonal factor in itself is a big problem for the manufacturers. You can bother them with codes of conduct and, you need to limit whatever the working hours and you need to do this and you need to do that, right? But then you dump these orders on them and basically you don't care that, in March, they're not very busy. In December, they're not very busy, but you dump everything on them, so they're very busy in June and July. There are some brands that, usually more upscale brand with a bit more margin and so on, and at a certain level. So they manage their cash and they level the amount of production all year long. Now it's a small minority, but it's very nice to see that, right? Then, in that case, the brand will go to the factory and say, okay, guys, you have no excuse. You're going to do this with ICTI. Okay, it's the kind of program for social compliance for toys. It's very common in toy industry. It's going to be unannounced audits, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, you have no excuse, right? And they can push their suppliers much harder than other toy manufacturers, because the other toy manufacturers, factories are going to say, yeah, you really want your container to be shipped out, by September, so it gets on the shelves, the first week after Thanksgiving or whatever. Well, you don't want to pay more, so how do we do? All of this is really induced by the buyer. You might say it's induced by the market, but I would say it's induced by the buyer because they don't level the production orders. And maybe it's very seasonal. Of course, if you have products that you will still sell easily 6 or 12 months later, because these are kind of forever green kind of products, of course, it's much easier to do, right? Again, it's not possible for every company. But this is an example, okay? Now, it's not just about the working hours and days off and things like that, okay? There's squeezing the price too much without taking into account the costs of making the products and complying, right? So, yeah, if you buy, again, in apparel, you buy products and you want the yarn to be dyed very fast, and you put a lot of pressure on pricing and everything. They would try to put it in these mills that do it, somewhere hidden in the hills, without any water treatment facility and so on. There's less of that in China. Obviously, they're getting kicked out and closed, but there's some of that in some other countries for sure, right? This is just an example, right? I mean, there's a lot to say also about responsible design practices, right? So if you design garments that are in very dark, let's say black, then there's many more dyes that are much more damaging to the environment that have to be used, right? That's an example. Or if you use aluminum rather than steel, well, it's 6 times more carbon emissions, right? And because it's much more energy intensive, et cetera, right? So
Mm.
Well, actually, we talked about that a few episodes ago about the eco-design principles, right? Eco-design principles is really about, how can designers have responsible, practices when it comes to environmental protection, right? That's really what it is. And today we're talking about purchasing, right? So when you work on certain kinds of materials that have to go through certain processes, you have safety considerations that also come into play that cannot be worked around, right? Etc., etc., etc. So basically, if you just issue purchase orders and you don't care about what's going on the production side and on the shipment side and everything, then you can't go back to the supplier and say, well, this is we have a tight code of conduct you have to sign and blah, blah. You have to comply with local law. You have to do this. You have to do that, right? Supplier is going to have to cheat, basically, to say, okay, that's fine. Here it is, right? Here's the paper, right? So that's responsible purchasing, okay? And there's a lot of things to talk about, but you can Google responsible purchasing practices and find more of that. Now, there's also the level above that you mentioned is sustainable purchasing. There is actually an ISO standard about sustainable procurement, as they call it. It's ISO 20400. And it kind of builds on ISO 26000, which is about what they call social responsibility, but also includes environmental protection and things like that. It's very wide. Okay. And it goes a bit further than 26,000. It really focuses just on what procurement organization can do to actually allow for more sustainability, right? So sustainability, again, is the sort of ideal state where no resource is consumed that that is no longer available. It's sort of everything we consume, like it's all sustainable. So we could keep going in theory forever. It doesn't deplete the natural resources and damages the environment in a way that's irreversible, etc., etc. Okay, it's kind of a nice ideal, and most companies try to just do less harm rather than really go to we are sustainable, right? But it's, let's say, it's what sustainable procurement is, what the purchasing people can do to get closer to sustainability, right, in their business and their suppliers' businesses, obviously. So what they say in this standard is, they say it provides guidance to organizations on integrating sustainability within procurement. Okay, so basically, what is sustainable procurement? The way they define it is procurement that has the most positive environmental, social, and economic impact possible over the entire life cycle, the entire life cycle of the product, obviously, through like extraction, initial processing, etc., manufacturing, shipments, transportation, blah, 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 use, disposal, maybe recycling, and so on. It's all along the supply chain, basically. All right. So this is an interesting topic. For a company that basically buys and resells products like an importer or retailer, there's what they call scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3, 1, 2, and 3 of emissions and things like that, right? Carbon emissions. So scope 1 is the activities you yourself do. So, for example, you I don't know, you have your own office and you heat it up in the winter and you cool it down in the summer, maybe if it's very hot, and so on. And then scope 2 is the things that could be in scope 1 but are outsourced. Like, for example, maybe you don't own the truck, but you rent the truck, right? So in that case, it's scope 2, but it's pretty much the same as scope 1, right? It's just outsourced. Okay, but then scope 3 is everything, in the supply chain of what you buy. So for retailers and a lot of importers, that's like 90%. 85 to 90% of the total emissions of the whole company, right?
Sure.
If you include scope 3, because imagine, right, any B&Q, Home Depot, Walmart, Tesco, and so on, all of the emissions, the carbon emissions of all the products through their shelves it just boggles the mind, right? It's way more than just running the stores.
How many suppliers have they got?
Right. And they don't even know. I tell you, they don't even know because the suppliers and the sub-suppliers and sub-sub-sub-suppliers and so on. So the idea is, how do they actually influence these 90%, right? And this ISO standard provides some general guidance. Okay, if you really want to go closer to sustainability, what are the kind of things that you can look at, right? And so basically what it goes through is, how to say, the way to actually manage procurement itself. That's an interesting one. But if you are not even running your procurement function properly, you're going to keep jerking your supply chain around like crazy. Just like we mentioned before, right? Like, oh, sorry, you need to do this design change. Sorry, but we cannot allow you to have more time. Oh, for production. Ouch, right? That's just not going to work, right? So the first thing is you get to actually know what you're doing, okay? And you have to think of how to prevent these kinds of big problems, right? That are typical, that are expected, let's say. You need to, okay, this is a typical ISO thing. Like, you need to think of the different stakeholders, right? So who has who is concerned, who has a stake, in who might have something to say, right, about the procurement function. It's not just the suppliers, right? It's also the government, and because it touches on compliance, respect the law, complying with the law, and so on and so forth. Okay, it's the suppliers, but it's also like the manufacturers might not be the same as your suppliers, right? It might be the employees of the suppliers, of the manufacturers, right? At the factory level, the employees. Well, some brands have actually done some work to engage directly the workforce of the factories, telling the management, hey, here's a training program, here's a training platform, here are some consultants that are going to come and provide a bit of training to your people, and then we're going to do this kind of activities to engage them and so on, right? So it's not necessarily just like the salespeople of the supplier. You need to think of what are the needs actually of all the stakeholders, right? And it's much wider than that. Risk management, I mentioned it, right? What are the typical risks, such as jerking your supplier around just by saying, oh, sorry, we need to change the design, or oh, sorry, whatever. Oh, we actually increased the order quantity, but you need to ship it at the same time. Can you do it? And then of course they can say no. But wait a minute, the business people are going to say, oh, this is great, let's take it, and then let's figure out later how to do it, right? Without any planning, anything like that. This is just terrible, really terrible. And then there's all kinds of other things, right? How do you do this? How do you how do you engage the employees? How do you make sure they actually pay the correct amount, and the factory respects the laws and so on? What can you do basically as a purchasing organization, right? Do you need to work with your suppliers, especially the vulnerable, stakeholders, again, such as the employees, maybe women working in some factories for example, in South Asia, and other places, sometimes might be in some kind of form of forced labor where they don't really dare to say certain things and say no and so on, right? but they might not be treated very nicely, right? What can you do? Actually, there are ways to do that. You can, get some consultants, provide them some training, as I was mentioning. You can give them a mechanism to actually have a way to complain about it to a third party and so on. You can actually review the HR practices of the factory to see, what are they doing? Oh, they pay by the piece already. That's a problem. They do this, they do that. They have penalties. Oh, they grab the ID card of the new workers and they keep it for 2 months. Oh, they whatever. They charge for the for the protective equipment, or they charge for the uniform, or okay, what's that, right? So some of these things are really ridiculous, and just by looking at the way the factories work, you know what? If you're a big buyer, you may not have direct control, but you have a lot of influence. Okay, that's really something that you can do, and so it's not just about social compliance, like making sure the people are treated the right way. It's also, as I mentioned, all throughout the supply chain, all throughout the product life cycle. What can we do? Can we look at the full supply chain and try to minimize the impact on the environment? Well, can we engage? Maybe as the buyer, you're buying some products that are already designed by the supplier, right? There's a lot of that. So you are not the design authority. You cannot do, eco-design, kind of, follow eco-design principles, as we mentioned 2 or 3 episodes ago. But you can put pressure on the supplier. You can force them for some of the items that you purchase in large quantity, for example, to do a life cycle assessment. And based on the life cycle assessments, you might see, okay, there's a lot of energy consumed here, a lot of water consumed here, or whatever, a lot of release of gases to the air here, whatever. What can you do to reduce these numbers, right? Do you need some help from us? But you need to do something. You start to apply some pressure, and that's how you actually end up having quite an impact if you're a relatively large buyer, right? Now, if you're not a big buyer, all of this kind of sounds like a nice wish list that is not very useful. I get that. If you're not a very big buyer, basically, can you do something? I would say it depends on the relative importance you have on your suppliers, right? If you really have no say over anything that they do, if you don't even have access to the manufacturer, things like that, there's not that much you can do, right? So try to think of responsible purchasing, what we talked about at the beginning of this episode. In terms of sourcing the right suppliers, do a little bit of due diligence, make sure they are aware of the requirements, make sure they can talk about it, make sure they have something to show for it. Okay, you'll be already ahead. It's already much better than sourcing just based on price, right? If you do design in your organization, then put a bit of, give some objectives to the designers so they follow eco-design principles. If it's at the supplier level, then try to estimate, even without the life cycle assessments, right? There's certain things we know are better than others. Certain materials are much better for the environment than others. Some certain materials cannot be recycled at all, or some materials, like I was mentioning, steel versus aluminum, consume much more electricity to make. All right. Also, the design of the product sometimes is pretty obvious, right? Well, when this, do we have a reliability test report on this component or on this product? Yes. Okay. So was the typical failure, right? If you know your product category, if you work in 1 or 2 product categories, you probably have a pretty good idea about that anyway. Then you can think, okay, when that component fails, can the product be disassembled? What can we do, right? Is it possible to have spare parts? Does the full product have to be thrown away? These are things that you questions you can ask yourself. You don't need to do, a life cycle assessment and all kinds of advanced things. You just need to educate yourself a little bit. And again, if you work in one or two product categories, it's usually you usually have a good idea, right? Talk to people in the industry, read about it, read about the common complaints about this kind of product, and so on and so forth. And it should not be very difficult for you to already make some progress, right?
And from a sustainability point of view, I suppose the number one benefit is that we are better global citizens as a business. We are better for the world, for the earth. I suppose number two is that being more sustainable is a USP that can help with, your brand and we mentioned Patagonia at the start. Patagonia, they're expensive, but people still buy it. Really, they're queuing up for it. And why? Because they know that they're sustainable, they do good, it's good quality. And so the sustainability really comes into brand building, maybe more and more these days, I suppose. And for number three, from a business point of view, you might have to do it, right? Because when we look at this in the context of some of the legislation that's coming in the EU, especially, and if you're not in the EU, I know that perhaps it doesn't apply to you immediately, but as you've said before on the podcast and in written content that we've made, Renaud, this sort of legislation, this is a trend that's coming globally now. So, looking at the EU eco-design for sustainable products regulation, you've mentioned that already. That is insisting that you have a more sustainable supply chain and more sustainable products. It's not, you should do it. You have to do it. So responsible and sustainable purchasing, I would say, for EU importers is probably something that you need to be getting on right now. And also there's the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive as well in the EU, which, again, you've got to report on your supply chain's environmental, social, and governance performance. Well, if you are not purchasing sustainably, you're immediately putting roadblocks ahead of that type of reporting, that type of performance. You're shooting yourself in the foot.
Yeah, absolutely. So the two regulations you mentioned, so eco-design for sustainable regulation, so sustainable product regulation, is coming into play roughly 2024, more like 2025, with horizontal requirements, and then sector by sector there will be more and more requirements added over time, and that's for all products except food and feed sold in the EU. Okay, not sure. I don't remember if the UK is going to go for it. Maybe not.
Yeah,
but at least
I don't know.
Yeah, right. At least the EU. But then the corporate reporting directive, the sustainable reporting directive, that's 2024 is only for big companies based in the EU. Okay, so smaller companies that do not sell to these big companies are not really don't really have to do anything now. But this is something we see that some banks in the EU are starting to ask for information, because it's a way to gauge the risks. Are these people actually putting in place the right system so that they're not exposed to undue risks? So it's going to be interesting to see the impact of all these questions from the banks, right? And then we can expect, yes, countries like Australia, Canada, maybe the UK in a certain way, who knows? They are going to follow in one way or another. And maybe states, US states like California or, New York State and so on, might also follow in a certain way, right? So it's the trend. It's the trend, right? As you say, even if you don't use it to build your brand, and be careful about greenwashing, because this also there's going to be more regulations around that, because it's been really abused. Even if you don't do it to build your brand, you might have to do it to keep access to certain markets. It's as simple as that. Yeah, and often also one more reason is in a lot of cases you actually save costs. The link would be like this: if you actually have products that consume less material, consume less energy, and so on and so forth, and are less exposed to non-compliance issues, right? Because some of the manufacturing processes might not actually be at the legal standards. The costs are going to be lower, okay? But with quality is a bit of a different relationship. It's more like make more reliable, more durable, better quality products. There's going to be less, and let's say higher quality, more consistent, more predictable manufacturing processes. There's going to be less scrap, less rework, and so on. There's going to be less products that fail in the marketplace and are thrown away prematurely, and that actually makes the whole thing more sustainable. But guess what? It also leads to lower costs, right? So that's the cost of poor reliability and cost of poor quality can be pretty high, right? So if you translate it into dollars, it's kind of scary, right? But it also has a cost on the environment for sure.
Yeah. So even if cost of the environment is not front of mind, cost of your bottom line as a business, surely that's got to be. So you've given a lot of good reasons here to consider looking further into responsible and sustainable purchasing. And that's been a really good overview, Renaud. So thanks.
All right. Yeah. Thanks.
Great. We are back next week as usual. Tune in then. And don't forget to give us 5 stars. We will love that. Thanks again for listening to this podcast brought to you by the Sofeast Group. We're on a mission to provide you with everything you need to manufacture effectively in Asia, including inspections, auditing, new product development support, contract manufacturing, 3PL warehousing and fulfillment, and much, much more across Asia's key manufacturing areas. Visit us at sofeast.com, that's SOFEAST.com, to learn more and get help. If you've enjoyed the podcast today, please do rate, review and share because it will really help others discover us too.